Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. I also would like to thank the conference organizers for selecting my paper. So Roderick, in his seminal paper published in the Journal of Economic Growth, argued that Sub-Saharan Africa, which is supposed to be the next labor-intensive manufacturing hub, is surprisingly deindustrializing prematurely. And this important statement has spurred a series of research suggesting that the role of manufacturing as a driver of long-run development is diminishing. An example of this research is the book by Howard, Dreemeyer, and Deyer titled The Trouble in the Making. And in the book, they essentially dismiss manufacturing as a potential engine of growth in the context of Africa. Stiglitz also, in citing Roderick in an important seminar at UNUI, that stated that Sub-Saharan Africa began its deindustrialization in the 1980s, much too prematurely and rapidly. And he concluded that traditional export-led manufacturing won't work in the case of Africa, just like it did in Asia. And on a more cautious note, he said that African policymakers should take a multi-pronged approach to development, basically emphasizing different combination of combining either agriculture and manufacturing or manufacturing and services based on new understanding of dynamic comparative advantages. On a more aggressive and extreme end, others have suggested molding services as alternative to manufacturing-based development strategy in the region. Example is the book by New Farmer, Page and Tapp, where basically they argue that some services exhibit the dynamic characteristics of manufacturing and therefore can play a very important role in the development of Africa. So basically, the argument is that policymakers in Africa should not focus entirely on manufacturing, but should consider some of these molding services. Clearly, these few examples show that the Roderick research or findings has influenced a lot of debate. That seems to suggest that manufacturing is a dead end in the case of Africa. But there are two reasons why we think it is too soon to conclude that Africa is deindustrializing, and as a consequence, rule out the possibility of manufacturing-led development in Africa. The first reason is that Roderick's sample is very limited to 11 out of the 46 Sub-Saharan African countries. And this gives us a limited picture of what is going on in the whole of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. And also the second reason is that in the 1980s and 90s, when there was economic crisis in Africa, most African countries did not support their statistical institutions to produce and disseminate reliable data. As a result, statistical capacity declined, and most GDP estimates were based on former enterprise surveys. So in the more recent years, especially in the 2000s, most African countries have undertaken reforms, statistical reforms, and improved their sectorial indicators, leading to a better understanding of the size and structure of many African countries. So the simple objective in this paper is to examine the extent to which the Roderick result will change when we use new sectorial indicators and vary the sample size or increase the number of countries that Roderick covered in his paper. So to do that, we use the expanded Africa sector database, which basically builds on the Africa sector database constructed here at Groningen Growth and Development Center. And basically extends it to 2015, taking into account the recent statistical revision in Africa, and also expand the number of countries to 18 countries. And this leads to, this database covers 80% of GDP in Africa. Again, of course, it's only 18 countries and there are 46 Sub-Saharan African countries too. So to even cover all the countries and understand what is going on in Africa, we use the UN National Account Database. And we complemented that with the Madison 2018 version of the Madison project database. And we basically ran the sort of regressions that Roderick did. Okay. So the key findings, the key take-home message from this exercise is that the result of deindustrialization or industrialization depends on the sample of countries that you consider in the regression. So when we repeat the same exercise, we find the same 11 countries, we find the same trends. When we use the expanded Africa sector database, which covers 18 countries and also covers, takes into account the recent statistical revision in Africa, and includes a broader coverage of informal activities, we observe output industrialization over time. When we use the UN database, which covers all the 46 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa from 1970s, what we observe is that for a typical Sub-Saharan African country, in the manufacturing output share of a typical African country has not significantly changed since the 1970s. There's, however, important regional differences. So for East Africa, we observe output industrialization, and for relatively rich Southern African sub-region, we observe deindustrialization. So this leads to two important conclusions that I would like to share with you. The first one is that taking into account the more recent statistical revision that covers the informal manufacturing activities, of course, changes the result from the negative trend that Roderick showed to a positive trend. And this suggests that we need to understand the nature of industrialization or structural change to be able to come out with strong conclusion. And this would require a database that covers both the formal and informal sector also by different sectors. And the last conclusion is that it's very difficult to say that Africa is deindustrializing, or it is too soon to make that strong conclusion. And therefore, industrialization may still be relevant for many low-wage African countries. So this is the big picture of the paper. But of course, I'm happy to answer your question. Thank you very much.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Yes.
I was wondering, so it would seem like there could be sort of three broad reasons why your results differ from those of Roderick.
Yeah.
One could be because of the data itself changing due to revisions. Another could be because of the expansion of the sample size in terms of countries. And the final could be the bringing it more up to date in terms of recency in the more recent years and whether they're dominating the sample. And whilst I know that you probably haven't intricately unpicked those yet, and that may come, what is your intuition regarding which may be the more dominant of those driving forces, or do you think they all play a role?
Thank you very much, Callum, for your question. I think the most dominant of all the three factors that you mentioned is the sample size, because when I use the same updated data, but only 11 countries, I observe the same trend that Roderick observed. But when I increase the sample size with the new updated data, I see this significant change from negative trend to a positive trend. So the most important factor here is the number of countries that is being considered in the regression.
I also have a question on slide 4. You said that the share of manufacturing is constant, but is that that's the output share? Okay, it went by quickly. So it's not the employment share; it's the output share. So the employment share, it's probably not declining as rapidly as in America, but it's probably still declining notably.
In our recent paper that Hyson presented during the first day of the conference, actually we see that there is kind of reindustrialization in employment. So in the context of Africa and developing Asia, it is not, there is no deindustrialization, there's actually a reindustrialization after the 1990s. So it's still very difficult to say that there is deindustrialization.
So that's interesting, because what we find in the West is that the output share is constant or goes up, but employment share goes down because productivity growth in manufacturing is higher than in the other sectors. And to make increase employment share consistent with the constant manufacturing output share, you must observe slower productivity growth in manufacturing than in other sectors.
Yes, yes, indeed. In many of developing countries, especially in Africa, we see that employment share is rising, but of course the nature of and the reindustrialization is what we are looking to explore further, whether it's being driven by informal manufacturing activities where productivity is low, or is driven by former large enterprises where productivity is huge. But that is something that we are still working on, and we will update you on that.
Hi, Emmanuel.
Hi.
This is Taryn here. This is great. I have a very quick data question, partly because I'm using Groningen's Africa sector database. So is the difference between the EASD that you are using and the Africa sector database just the number of countries? Or do you also update the data in the EASD relative to what's in the 10 sector database just for?
Yes. Yes, it's not only the number of countries, but I also take into account the recent statistical rebasing across most African countries.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that is very important.
Thanks.
So Emmanuel, so another thing is, so the Groningen people had, I thought, a very nice paper on the competitiveness of Europe in economic policy, where you see that for successful manufacturing countries in Europe, like Germany and Italy, the majority of employment contributing to goods production is now in the service sector. But that was not the case in a country like Britain, where the service sector is totally disconnected from manufacturing. So I guess it would be hard for you to get at that with your data, but I think it's very important that services can service inputs to manufacturing, or it can be totally disjointed from it, and I think that's important as well in Africa.
Yes, I think it will be very interesting to examine that in the case of Africa, but that will require more data work. I will be happy to do that, maybe as a next paper.
Emmanuel, something related to just what he said, I think that what would be interesting is to divide the service sector into high and low productive sectors. Because if I really look at what's going on in many of the African countries, you have a large, low productive service sector. Yeah. But recently, let's say from the 2000s or late 2000s, right, you start to seeing the high productive service sector going on, increasing. So it's good if you have enough data to explore this. And the other thing I can see is that, you know, these path of labor shares and also output shares, they vary over decades, so they vary. And because here, as you know, there have been some changes in policy where some governments are trying really to push